welcome to the latest in the Lockdown Your Learnings webinar series. My name is Paul Hearns. I've been documenting ICT in Ireland for more than 20 years now. And this series has covered a number of important technology topics over the last few months, and all of the previous sessions are available on the ICT SkillNet YouTube channel, which is available on a link from ictskillnet.ie, along with a program of upcoming events. So today we're here to talk about people, teams, and how to work today and tomorrow. So work had become complicated before the pandemic started, and there were complex team structures and departments and complex interactions moved towards new methodologies and, of course, a raft of new collaboration tools to underpin it all. But then when the pandemic hit, it meant that many people were moved to working practices and conditions that they weren't necessarily properly prepared for. So there have been problems in dealing with this situation effectively across all areas of businesses. So while there are issues there are also potentially opportunities to institute transformation ambitions and new ways of working that may have been difficult or have taken much longer to implement previously. So here to look at all of these issues and to see how people and teams can thrive under these new conditions, we have Clare Dillon, who's a technology evangelist. So Clare is going to talk about open source development and the open source community and how they work on massive distributed projects and what they can tell us about those kind of cohesive structures and organizing, especially with remote and distributed teams. So Richard is going to talk from a more service provider perspective. So with his company being a long-standing service provider, they have quite a bit of experience in supporting organizations in both providing and consuming in the as-a-service delivery model. So with a broad understanding of what people need and how teams can best leverage these things in working under the current conditions. So just in terms of our format today, there's going to be two short presentations, and then we will go into a discussion format. So you will see at the bottom of your console that you have a Q&A option. So please do feel free to submit questions there, and we can address those to the panel. So you can pop something in there throughout, but we'll keep the questions to the discussion portion. We'll also have some polls today that we'll get you to fill out as we go, and we'll discuss those as we run through. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Clare, and she's sharing her screen there now, and I'll get Clare to begin her presentation. Clare.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me here on the podcast. I'm delighted to be here. First of all, I'd like to just say hello and give a little bit of background to the topic I'm going to discuss today. So I've been, over 20 years in the technology industry, but for the last about 3 years, I have become more involved with both open source development communities and inner source development communities. And inner source being the practice of open source, but within organizations, usually to create proprietary code. And I think what's interesting for me is that some of the topics that we talk about in terms of collaboration and everything that Paul just mentioned, a lot of those kinds of areas and issues are things that the open source and the inner source communities have been grappling with for some time. And I spoke on this podcast back in April about the various different trends that had been emerging for a long time as being important to innovation. Things like experimentation to deal with complexity, ever-growing complexity, things like decision-making, and things like collaboration. And as Paul said, that was at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's very clear to me that actually these sorts of challenges have become just more difficult over the last few months. And we have been pushed into experimenting with new ways of working, even if we weren't quite ready to go there. Going into a cycle of trying to manage my energy around the pandemic, I seem to be in a kind of a cycle of eat, drink, sing, repeat. I put sing in there. Everyone has their own way of dealing with how they manage their own energy levels. For me, music is the thing. So I either listen to music, or sometimes I go down to the kitchen and have a good old sing song to myself. That really, really helps dealing with stress and just to manage my own energy. And so it was actually that actually gave me some inspiration for today's talk, because one of my most favorite musical instances in the last little while has been Hamilton. I don't know if any of you are fans. I am a huge fan. And there's one song that I particularly like in Hamilton called The Room Where It Happens. Now, again, if you're not a musical fan, I am thankfully not going to put you under listening to me singing or anything like that. But there's this text, there's a lyric in The Room Where It Happens. Now, The Room Where It Happens is, Hamilton in general is a musical about a historical figure, Alexander Hamilton, around the time of the American War of Independence and the founding fathers coming together to bring together the United States of America. And there's this one particular song sung by Aaron Burr, another character, and he's talking about the room where it happens, where Hamilton gets together with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they do a deal which in history has been called the Compromise of 1790. And Hamilton basically wanted to get the banking and the financial system in place for the United States of America. And as a result, he actually gave away the idea of having the capital city, moved it from New York to Washington, D.C., which was closer to the South than Thomas Jefferson. Now, this isn't a history lesson, but there's this one amazing lyric in the song where it talks about being in the room where it happens. Aaron Burr, who later becomes a vice president, but he wanted to be there. And it's about the idea that those three gentlemen went for dinner one night, and those political decisions were made at the dinner. And I remember thinking, the lyric goes, no one knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens. And it dawned on me that there's something about that, because so many decisions that are made in corporate contexts, and so many important decisions that are made in the context of digital transformation rely on some room where that decision is made. And the people who get to be in that room are often a small subset of perhaps the people who should be involved in the decision. So it struck me two things. One is that this idea of having rooms where it happens, some sort of closed place where the people in the know get to have dinner and make the decisions. In some respects, that actually limits inclusivity in the decision-making process. In some respects of how decisions are made around around digital transformation or anything else. In some respects, it stops clarity happening. In the aftermath of this song, in the musical, there's a lot of kind of spin going on as to how the power play worked within the room. But no one knows. That was the whole thing. No one else was in the room where it happened. Now, for me, when we think about that sort of construct, it's probably not the most helpful way of going about collaborative innovation practices. But then what dawned on me is that since the pandemic, there is no rooms where it happens, because everyone has moved away from their offices. So wherever that room was in many organizations, and usually there would be a cultural equivalent of that for many organizations, they're gone. Right? They've been taken away. We've been stripped of that construct that was kind of an informal way in which decisions were made. I mean, maybe you could say there's a Zoom where it happens these days, perhaps, but I'm thinking that might be actually less effective. So when we think of that, how do we get around the idea of some of these cultural constructs that may be informal having been stripped from us? And for me, some of the things we have to think about have been exhibited for a long time in the open source and inner source communities, because in both of those development communities, they are, by their very definition, designed for asynchronous collaboration with a distributed team who will not be necessarily in the same room. And so there are some lessons we can learn from those communities that can help us perhaps thinking about collaboration in this new world. So when I talk about open source in this context, most people might be familiar with the idea that an open source software is it describes the software license that accompanies some software. In this case, it would be software that's available to be modified or reused and viewed. But for the context of this presentation, I'm talking about open source and inner source more in the context of the community practices, the way that people work in open source communities and inner source communities, as opposed to anything related to the legal aspects of that. So let's look at some of the trends. For me, one of the first things is, in the open source community, there's an awful lot of transparency and trust. So in my experiences, almost everything is done in the open. Minutes are shared with the entire community and available to be viewed. There's a lot of trust built into the whole way that people work. For example, I work with the Inner Source Commons community. And one of the things, the way that they work is that they actually have, for example, a Slack channel with over 600 members on it. And it's all run by a rule that's called Chatham House rules, which means that everyone who joins the channel agrees to the principle that everything that happens in the Slack channel stays in the Slack channel, or at least the attribution of who says what stays in the Slack channel. So the agreement is that you can take learnings from this community and the Slack channel, and you can share them outside that community, but you can't attribute any conversation or anything that anyone says to a person within the community. And that allows for real honesty and collaboration across borders that honestly, it's lovely to see. But what amazes me is that it works on such a great scale, on such a grand scale, because fundamentally, everyone involved in that community trusts each other. And that is a huge benefit and something I think we can learn from. The second thing that often happens in those communities is that co-creation is always valued over control. And I, again, think this is a huge mind shift that we have to make when we think about how we do innovation. Because for so long, the technology industry has been tied to this idea that control is the best thing, that you have the biggest benefit in whatever you create. However, what's really showing these days is that if you want speedy development, if you want to move at the speed that is necessary, and if you want to leverage best practices from a general community, then co-creation and leaving the space for that it actually trumps control in terms of the benefit of the end, and the end result. So this idea of how do you create space for people to co-create that sometimes has to be balanced with this idea that you want to control everything that's happening. And that again is a cultural shift in terms of both how we develop software, but also how we work within organizations that I think, it might be interesting to explore. A third area is also related to kind of speed. And it's interesting because in the open source and inner source communities, there is a huge emphasis on giving agency to individuals. Because sometimes when you do give away control and when you are very explicit about giving agency to individuals on your team or even outside your team, that can provide a huge array of other collaborators who can provide huge value to your project. And related to that, in the inner source and open source communities, and that means giving people the space to come forward and contribute, but also telling them how and providing really easy on-ramps for people to get involved in various different projects. Corporations, we don't put as much emphasis on that. Like onboarding is thought of as a kind of a after the fact, sure, buddy up with someone and, you'll be up to speed in a couple of months. But there's no explicit thought process given to how do we provide people with on-ramps into new projects that perhaps could widen the collaboration network that might be involved in such a project. Another area that I find very interesting in those communities is that they spend a lot of time documenting the way that they work. So when we talk about culture often within organizations, it's sometimes described as the way things are done around here. And of course, the problem with that is that you have to have been around that kind of culture for quite a while to know how these things work, or maybe where the room where it happens or whatever. But there's always a set of unspoken rules in organizations that newbies have to kind of learn in order to be the most effective as they can be. In these open source communities, in order to accelerate collaboration and onboarding and participation and inclusion, a lot of effort goes into actually writing down, this is how we work around here. Now, these aren't formal documents. We're not talking about pages and pages of manuals of procedures for meetings and all this sort of thing. It can be very informal, but it gives people an idea about the way people do work. So I'll give an example in that respect. One of the examples that I kind of love is one of the rules by which the Inner Source Commons community works, is this idea of lazy consensus. And it's described as the idea that, you don't have to ask everyone for permission to do things in this community. If you have a good idea and you're pretty sure it's a good idea and that other people will think so, well, then just assume that people will agree with you and communicate. So do what you were going to do and then communicate that you've done it, because you want to tell people that something's been done through established channels. But the thing is, be prepared to roll it back if there is some objection or feedback that you may not have been familiar with. Now, this is not necessarily the case for every scenario, but the community, the Inner Source Commons community, has kind of outlined examples of the many, many places where people should just assume agency, assume that they can just go ahead and do something. And as long as the scale of the change isn't huge and that it can be reversible and that the impact isn't like far reaching or that, for whatever reason, this is a simple change, then just go ahead and do it. Now, moving from a permission-based culture and an ownership-based culture to this idea of having people have agency and move to this idea of kind of lazy consensus, again, can really accelerate the kind of collaboration and just movement on projects that I think we're sometimes missing in very hierarchical organizations where things are fixed and people feel like they're only allowed to do what they've been told they're allowed to, and limits the potential of a team working together where they may be actually seeing opportunities that perhaps management and leadership just don't see because they're not close to the problem. So I love this idea of giving agency and giving people the permission to do what they think is the best thing to do, while being conscious that there may be scenarios where they may have to reverse that. Another thing that I love in the open source and inner source communities is that there is a huge emphasis on appreciation. And a lot of thought goes into how do you reward people for great collaboration. And that's done not just on the end result, it's done on effort. And it reminds me of all the parenting tips we get for teaching our kids how to do things well, that, we should be rewarding the effort, not necessarily whether they got 100% in their exams. And it strikes me that we could all do with a bit of that, right? Because when you want to encourage collaboration, you really need to encourage collaboration. And the best way to do that is to appreciate the people doing it and to call them out for that. And also, this community takes time to connect. At the beginning of the Inner Source Commons summits, they actually have lobby hangout time, which is meant to replicate the idea of just hanging out in the lobby of an event in real space, which I really like. But they also have an app in their Slack channel called a Donut app, which is just matches people up to have a chat, because God knows we need some chats and human interaction in this world. And we miss that. It's another of those, informal constructs that have been stripped from us now that we're no longer in offices every day. So sometimes looking at the solutions that have emerged in these communities can help us work even if we're not in software development. So the last thing is that it's just to have a bit of purpose. And we don't have to be changing the world with every project you're involved in. But I have noted that most people in the open source and inner source world, they like to think that whatever they're doing could have impact beyond their own priorities. And they think like that. And so in many respects, some things that they build, it has more longevity than some things that I have seen being built for a very specific purpose, which may again not be able to be reused by other people. So this idea of reusing and having impact beyond your original plan can be very powerful. So that's just the 6 areas that I thought were interesting, that I see the open source and inner source community. They practice these things. And sometimes I think perhaps we can take these ideas and leverage them in other ways of working when you're not developing software. And it may actually help us. And the last thing I'll say is, we talk about the future of work, but this is now and it's evolving now. So for me, a very important opportunity exists today in this pandemic situation that should allow us to experiment with these new ways of working. And who knows, some of these might stick after the pandemic ends. So I certainly hope so. There's lots of ways of working in there that I love, and I hope some of you might find interesting as well. So thank you very much. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Claire. Some very interesting points there, and some terms certainly to add to my lexicon. So we'll revisit those as well. I noticed as well that there was a hand up there from one of the participants. So I'm not ignoring you, but it's just we're quite tight for time on this. We'll come back to any points at the discussion portion. But I'd like to just reintroduce Richard O'Brien, Technical Director at Triangle Computer Services. And Richard is just going to talk about how, as a long-standing service provider, that they have the lessons they have learned in supporting people and organizations as they consume services and as they move towards the more service model that seems to be characterizing how a lot of organizations work at the moment. So, Richard, please.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute today. So, as Paul said, at Triangle, we've been supporting customers delivering to services and capability to their end users for a long number of years at this point. But typically in an organization, that has been a certain tier of the organization had the capability to work from home. And what's happened with the pandemic is really all parts of the organization now have to have the capability to work from home and have to understand what that means and how people work together. So what I wanted to do is really just step through a couple of scenarios that we've come across and that might resonate with some people on the webinar today, and just to bring out some of the points that we have observed as we've gone through. So the first item I just wanted to go through, first team really was around a creative team. So in a retailer, creative team developing all of the content. They had traditionally worked closely together within head office. They had a specific set of equipment to operate an iMac environment. They worked locally with resources. So when the pandemic hit, that team was dispersed really around the country, and had a number of challenges specifically around connecting to the services back in head office. Physically, the footprint of the devices was something that was a problem. They had 27 32-inch screens they had to work with. From a team perspective, they were closely knit. They had all of the capability to work together, but the underpinning infrastructures that provided those services to them couldn't really deliver or wasn't delivering for them. So the productivity started to suffer. There were concerns that they weren't meeting targets. There were concerns around some of the security associated with what was happening. They'd never worked remotely. They didn't have the understanding or the lexicon to really articulate where their problems were, what the solutions that they needed. And they'd never really thought about how they worked as a team while they were in the office. So we spent a bit of time with them, understanding the workflow in the terminology that we at Triangle might use if they weren't necessarily familiar with that type of terminology. Just understanding how they work and then what the technology fixes to do that. And I think from our perspective, it was a learning in that, we're expecting people to adopt and drop into this new kind of work without really educating and talking to them, without onboarding them, as Claire mentioned for her presentation earlier. So people really do need to understand that the tools they've been using on a weekly and a daily basis over the last number of years are not necessarily the right fit. They need to have the space to call that out. They need to have the space to make some suggestions. So again, coming to some of the points that Claire made earlier on. And, we worked with that team. We went through a number of different options with them. And we went through those options in conjunction with the IT department to make sure that, all the things that IT want to look after, like security, and ensuring the devices were protected and corporate data was protected. And we came to a solution cooperatively around what that would look like. It wasn't necessarily something that suited everybody, but now that team can cooperate and work together. A lot of the administrative teams in hospitals were decanted back home. They didn't want that extra volume of people coming into the hospital on a daily basis. From a number of perspectives, space being one of them. But again, and there was great buy-in from these teams of individuals to go home and start using their own technology stacks, or to make space at home to be able to use the services that were being provided from the hospital, because healthcare was stretched financially as it was. But as that has continued, some of that goodwill or some of that capability just isn't really suited from a long-term perspective. So from a hospital perspective now, they're having to look at what solutions can we deliver to these teams cost effectively, and the types of things beyond just administration, that maybe physios and delivering care in the community. So we want to be able to share devices, hygiene being taken into account, of course. So things like Chromebooks, which would never have been considered in a healthcare environment before, suddenly come front and center as a device that can easily be shared among a large group of people. From a data security perspective, has a strong set of protections built in and a strong capability in that area. And we're starting to see then the adoption of that more broadly then across a whole new industry based on some of the challenges that have been because of the pandemic. So just a quick recap on some of those lessons. Really, education. There's a lot more people working from home who wouldn't have traditionally done that. They do need some education, some onboarding, some empowerment around helping them how they should be working, how they should be interacting, the type of tools that are working for them, the type of tools that aren't working for them. And so it really is important to engage with those end users and understand how this is, what their experience is. From a technology perspective, again, it's worth looking at the portfolio that an organization has. And there is lots of capability out there, there's lots of innovation in the market. And so what is the best technology fit for that user today? In the past, it might have been desktop PC. What's the best fit technology for that job role and that user today? Obviously, security is front and center in everything, and it's something that probably didn't initially get the attention it needed. And I think there's a lot of mopping up being done, and a lot of audit findings will be coming out of the cupboard over the next couple of months. But again, bearing in mind security and also privacy. In particular, we come across a number of scenarios where the employer assumes that an end user will use their personal device, maybe for a second factor of authentication to allow them. But there's no education to the privacy impact of that, or the sensitivity an end user might have to using a personal device in the work context, even though it's a very specific role. So again, making a consideration on the privacy side and just keeping people informed and aware of why and how these services will be used. So that kind of just a quick summary of some of the learnings that we've had, Paul. So that was really me from an overview perspective on where we've been helping customers over the last.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's again some very interesting points there that often you wouldn't think of. That that last point around privacy and the use of a personal device for a work situation. Again, it's a consideration that a lot of people probably wouldn't necessarily have thought of. So thank you very much for that. Okay, well, what I'm actually going to do is I'll get our producer Aideen to load our first poll, because I'm conscious of time. We're only opening our discussion now, but we have a couple of comments in already. The person who put their hand up earlier was just thanking Clare for her sage advice and covering areas that are often not talked about, which I think is really interesting. Certainly, one of the really interesting points I think you made there, Clare, was around this idea of lazy consensus. Try and do things that are simply, unproductive or genuinely abrasive. So I think being free enough in your role to presume that you can proceed on the basis that it's generally a good idea, but being prepared to roll back if it doesn't suit or if the time isn't right. How do you go about encouraging that sort of freedom if, as you said, in a more hierarchical organization, it may not have been naturally there before?
Well, I think it is. First of all, it's about being clear that is the expectation, and I guess that's part of what I was describing there. In what I found is that in the inner source and open source communities, it's almost you almost have to be explicitly clear and keep repeating that this is the expectation. This is how we work. So first of all, it's kind of you give the permission to not ask for permission in the future. That's the first thing. So that's a leadership thing, or it's a grassroots or a communal decision that a team makes. Excuse me. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is to keep reminding people and then to reward and to call out people who are doing it, right? Because, what you don't want is to have someone try it and then get slapped down going, what do you mean you did that? You didn't ask such and such and such and such and such and such. And that's a very kind of what I would now consider to be how we used to work, right? Where there's this permission structure. I have to get sign off for 3 levels. What I feel is what I believe is the trends that are happening is that the people who see the opportunities for innovation are often very close to the problem. And if we don't give space for them to take agency and to try these things through, for example, lazy consensus, to try and work out the issues, and then perhaps to share their experiences, which is a key part of that as well. That is for me one of the key areas for when we talk about an innovation culture. That's what it means. It means giving people the permission and the freedom and the supports, and what. In complex adaptive systems, they'd call it enabling constraints. So, enough constraint to keep them safe. So you give them guidance around, don't go off and try brain surgery as an experiment. But if you want to try a new meeting format, go right ahead. So it's this idea that you give people permission and then you reward them for it.
Okay. And Richard, say from your perspective, enabling the kinds of services and technologies that allow people to work both collaboratively and remotely, do you see people willing to experiment, willing to maybe kind of push the usages a little bit in terms of how they engage?
I see the desire, but I think one of the issues is that IT want to continue to operate the model they've always operated. And the view is we've had remote workers, we just have a lot more remote workers. But maybe there's a better way for those people who are now remote working to do their job. And I see one of the comments there about the use of technology from a home working. And I think most people can absolutely use the technology, build the right technology for the job they're doing. Is it adding additional complexity to the way they're working? Is it slower than the way they used to work? And asking that question, I think, is important for IT teams to not to just assume that, working from home is equivalent to having a PC on your desk, but to find out what additional might be valuable to the end user.
Okay, so
I'd like to. Can I just add in on that as well?
Sorry,
because
just before you come in there, Claire, just to highlight the comment that Richard is referring to there is just somebody saying that they have a problem with colleagues not necessarily or complaining that they're not able to work from home properly because supports aren't there. So say they're saying if someone can use an iPhone 11, it might be a little bit disingenuous. But I suppose we've all experienced that situation whereby a colleague might have a little bit of learned helplessness if they're suddenly using things in a manner that they're not used to or under circumstances that they're not used to. So sorry, Claire, go ahead. It's just
I was going to make that point. I've had an experience even in the last week, and I would consider myself fairly technically competent. Certainly know how to use my phone. I was put onto a new event platform, and I was panicking. I was going around clicking buttons randomly, and it was all going haywire. And I have to say that in many respects, sometimes when you're introduced to a new tool or a new scenario, you think it's intuitive, you think you should be able to do it, but it's not that simple when it's just not familiar. That's all,
Indeed, no, a very good point. And again, I suppose it's just one of those areas of friction that you need to be aware of and to be able to handle appropriately in these situations. But I'm just going to share the results of the poll, which I think are quite encouraging. So we just asked people if they think that there are people in their organizations are working effectively under the current conditions? And it's overwhelmingly yes, with a few don't knows, but no definite negatives there. So I think that's very encouraging in that people are engaging with that. So I think that's good. So Richard, say from your perspective, does that tally with what you're seeing among your clients?
I think business is operating. There's no doubt about it. But for it to become the way of working in the future, areas of enhancement and improvement, and really around that end user experience piece. Yeah, I think that's where. And to be fair, organizations are looking at that now. They're realizing that it's not a case of handing someone a laptop and saying, go home and work. There's a whole bunch of other nuanced things have to happen around that. And organizations are starting to go back and look and review and see what that optimal path is going to be into the future.
Okay, Claire, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I also want to add, I think, in some respects we're facing the same problem as when you have a movement, a market movement, right? So always the early adopters are always willing to put up with stuff that maybe the vast majority of people wouldn't, because the early adopters in working from home really wanted to make working from home work, right? Because they were the people who wanted to work from home. And now you've got a whole load of people who really are like, well, I'm forced into this scenario, and they're less patient, and they're maybe less work or to put up with bad UI, for example. So sometimes I think that what we see in this is the natural reaction to a broader set of the market now working with these tools. And I think it's going to be great, because ideally we should be listening to that feedback. And as an industry, a technology industry, we should respond, because to be honest, some of the UI for some of the tools we use is not great. So good to have it fixed. We'd all appreciate it. And
it's good to see that user experience has certainly it has gone beyond pure development, and it's being the principles that were forged during application and service development are now being applied. But again, we have another comment in there just talking about innovators being close to the problem and giving them agency to develop solutions. So coming in on your point, Claire, that allowing people the latitude to experiment a little, to be able to play with things before perhaps bringing them forward and exposing them to the whole team to see where to take them from. So I suppose, how do you deal perhaps with the potential for a little bit of chaos there, that if people are actually going on a little bit of a solo run here or there, that you don't want to dampen the enthusiasm, but you need to have it under control as well. So maybe, Claire, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is down to this idea of what kind of enabling constraints. I remember talking to one organization who were trying to do experiments, and then they were concerned that too many people would spend too much time thinking up of new solutions to things, like simultaneously, for example. And so that does come down to having some sort of supporting kind of way for people to share, well, look, I'm working on this, or I'm thinking that, or whatever. And these are all the problems of collaboration when you don't have one person in control of something, but you're trying to have a group of people move together simultaneously and create something better between them. So things like what Anik was describing, things like privacy by design and security by design, like in many respects, I mean, if we were talking about tech solutions, one would hope that an organization would have some policies around privacy by design and security by design that would stop people from doing things that, for example, would be dangerous to the organization or something like that. So, ideally, random people don't have access to your entire email list that they've decided to experiment with by sending them out pictures of puppies or something. I don't know, but the point is, you wouldn't want that, right? That would be in the realm of perhaps I don't kind of want to start my experimentation there, but because first of all, that's not reversible, as we discussed earlier. You couldn't roll that back. There will be areas where people are looking for solutions, where there are known issues, and so experimentation in that area are probably welcome. And then there's probably areas where you don't want them necessarily experimenting in. And then it's up to an organization to kind of say, look, if you're thinking in these areas, anything to do with customer data, anything to do with personal private information, like maybe check with this person who knows about privacy with design and security with design, and work together with them, because you'll learn something too. And so this isn't a handoff. It's not a faceless transfer of knowledge, but it's learning together, and maybe you can come together as a team to experiment on that.
Okay. Well, I'll just ask Aideen then to put up our second poll, and people can be looking at that as we go. But again, just to maybe come back to one of the points that you made, Richard, in terms of administrative teams. Now, you were talking about it in the medical context, but I think that administrative people in general are some of the most put upon in recent months, insofar as core admin was very rarely outside of the business premises, and those kinds of people suddenly found themselves having to access the likes of accounting or ERP or these kinds of things remotely when they may not have done before. So can you just talk a little bit about specifically those kinds of operations and how adaptation has gone there in your experience, and what people can do to facilitate it more?
Yeah, well, I think what's happened is, and really it depends on the organization. So some organizations literally gave everybody a laptop and sent them home, and then from an end user perspective, the technology was there, whatever space they could make use of at home, and the device was very specific to their role in that organization. But there's a whole tier of other organizations and some of the public sector organizations where that just wasn't something that was feasible. So there was an expectation then that people would use their own technology platforms, a little bit like some of the conversations that have gone on around education and the kind of digital divide in education as to what people can provision themselves to muddle through in their job roles. And that's fine for a couple of weeks, but I think that's where the challenges started to come in. And we see that kind of two-tier scenario where, how do I cost effectively deliver, and this is where the opportunity with the innovation is, how do I cost effectively deliver services to a much broader set of remote users, a different skill set of remote users who would traditionally have used those services, but still allow them to be productive, still allow them to move in and out of the office if we have to transition people in pods through the office scenario. So it's not a one solution fits all. It's very much a different set of tools depending on the organization. So I think to the earlier point, it's really looking at that job role and making decisions about the best technology fit for that role.
Okay. All right. I'm just going to share the poll results there, and again, it's encouraging on the one side in that we asked people what the major inhibitor for effective working under the current conditions were, and lack of personal contact with team members is well up there, as well as lack of coordination from team leaders and managers. So broadband doesn't seem to be a major issue, although it is flagged. Tools and services, again, not necessarily a major issue, but flagged. So I think, again, it's coming back to those kind of organizational issues, really. Maybe I'm conscious of time. If we'll maybe get a comment from each of you on that, and then maybe a final word of advice before we wrap. So, Claire, in terms of personal contact and coordination from leaders, what can you offer on that?
Actually, that was going to be my final advice, so I'll do 2 for 1 on that one, because I think that when we think about how work is done today, remotely and distributed fashion, or we're not creating something that supports is this idea of personal relationships, because so many meetings every hour, they all have a focus. It's a business job, but we don't have all that informal connection making that we do in offices and in workplaces, in meet spaces, as I've heard it described. But the idea being that we have to almost artificially inject that. So my advice to people would be that, you can have a personal conversation over Zoom when you turn on the camera and you've got broadband. Like it does work. It's just that if you have a meeting that you have to get through with bullet points, you're not going to be able to just chat and shoot the breeze like you would at the coffee machine. I think we have to make space for that. I think we absolutely have to do that with the people we know, to strengthen connections, and also think about how do we do that with people we don't know elsewhere in the organization, to build these connections that will allow us to learn about different parts of the organization and broaden our awareness about the challenges that face all of us.
Thank you. Richard, what does that compare with you?
It's about, for me then, it's about engaging with the community of users that you have. This is not, a lockdown because it snowed for a week and everybody went home. And this is a real transition in the way people operate and the way people are delivering for your business. So just go out and talk to them, understand what's working and what's not working for people from a technology perspective. And don't be afraid to let people, experiment and feedback into the organization. And that's as much from the business owner perspective as well as the IT department's perspective. Engage and understand what's working, what's not working.
Okay. Well, there's another comment there that's possibly one of the unintended consequences, but certainly could be a benefit there, where it's saying, is the paperless office finally going to be here, but will regulatory authorities move as quick? That I think I first heard that term in about 1994. And I'm still waiting for it, certainly. But if the current situation hastens it, I think that would certainly be good. And I think we all know the answer to the regulatory authorities and how quickly they'll move. So we won't necessarily need to go into that. But thank you very much to Clare and Richard. There's some great insights there. And I think, again, just ensuring that those human issues are talked about, and that there is the latitude there to both discuss them and as you said, to provide that space for experimentation. So some of the upcoming editions in the Lockdown Your Learning series. So next week, Successful Solution Architects, and Leo Payton from IASA Global is going to be leading that session with Paul Priest, the CEO and founder as well. So in terms of upcoming sessions then, there will also be Joan Mulvihill will be talking about creativity for a culture of innovation on the 19th. And Mark O'Sullivan then maximizing research, development and innovation supports. And then Lavinia Morris will be talking about enterprise change and innovation and the must-win battles. And then a very interesting session for the 10th of December, where we'll be talking about quantum computing with Venkatesh Kannan from the Irish Centre for High-End Computing, and he'll be joined by Kieran Fennessy from Citi as well. So that should be a very interesting session. So thank you again to our participants today, to Clare and to Richard, to Aideen, our producer, and thank you all for joining us and for your comments and insights as well. So that's it for today, and hopefully we'll see you on another Lockdown Your Learning session.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this webinar, please follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn to be kept up to date with all our news, events and programs. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like this one.